So most of us already know that counterpoint is the art of interweaving multiple independent melodic lines that work together in harmony. Here we have Bach's C-sharp minor fugue from his first well-tempered clavier, and as you can see, he sometimes has two independent voices going on, 3, 4, and even 5, since this is a 5-voice fugue. So yeah, counterpoint is definitely the art of combining multiple independent melodic lines, but there's also another art to counterpoint, and that is the art of exploiting and controlling dissonance. So let's think about how counterpoint is taught for a second. Counterpoint is generally taught through what we call species counterpoint. We start with first species, or one-to-one counterpoint, where we actually aren't allowed to use any dissonances at all. We then move on to second species counterpoint, where our first two types of dissonances are introduced, our passing dissonance and our neighboring dissonance. Third species involves 4 notes against 1, thus enabling us to use more than one passing and or neighboring dissonance per measure. Third species also introduces an interesting figure called the cambiata, which actually allows us to leap to and from 2 consecutive dissonances. I'll elaborate upon this in further installments when we tackle a third species exercise. Fourth species, my personal favorite, introduces the suspension, a special type of dissonance that occurs on the strong beat of the measure. And fifth, or what we call florid counterpoint, is a combination of all previous species and what most closely approximates free composition. In this example, you can see that we mix fourth, third, and second species. So with that being said, let's take a look at this second species example. At first glance, this seems like a pretty good realization. We have contrary motion going on, stepwise movement, very parsimonious, but what's off? Well, there's not a single dissonance. I mean, let's step back for a second. The whole point of second species is to introduce our passing and neighboring dissonances, so not utilizing them kind of misses the point. Let's take a listen to this one. So yeah, it doesn't sound bad, but it doesn't really have any interest. It kind of sounds a little flat. Now let's go back to first species. In first species, dissonances aren't allowed, so how can we control and exploit dissonance when we aren't allowed to use it? Can we even do that? Before I answer that, I'd like to propose a little scenario. Take this simple line, a G jumping to a C. If I were to ask you to harmonize that C with a single bass note on the downbeat, what would you choose? What would be the best note to use? Now keep in mind, we're going to assume we're in C major, so let's only limit ourselves to the white keys. When I was first asked this question, I immediately picked E. My reasoning was pretty simple. We already have a G and a C, so adding an E would complete the chord and imply a C major chord in first inversion. Now this answer is perfectly fine, but it's not the best. It's a little vanilla. Let's systematically go through all the white keys and see what we get. So let's start with C. Now C isn't a horrible option, but it's definitely not the best. C to C gives us an octave, which makes it sound a little empty, a little hollow. Furthermore, it gives us no harmonic information. Is this C major? Is it C minor? It just isn't enough. Next up is D. D creates a seventh with a soprano, which is a dissonance, but dissonances aren't allowed in counterpoint unless properly treated, and in this case, we're leaping into a dissonance, which is really not allowed. Then we have our F. F presents the same problem we had with our C. F and C creates a fifth, which is a little empty and hollow sounding, and once again, we don't have much harmonic information here. Is it F major, F minor? Who knows? On to G. G creates a perfect fourth with the C, and although it's a perfect interval, perfect fourths are actually considered dissonances in counterpoint. So this wouldn't be allowed since the dissonance isn't dealt with properly. And now B. Aside from sounding pretty harsh, B and C creates a dissonance of a ninth, which is once again just not dealt with properly. You probably noticed I skipped A. As you may have guessed, A is indeed the answer. But before I explain why, let's go back and listen to the only other possible answer we came up with, E. Let's compare it to the A. We'll start with the E. And now the A. Now, I don't know about you, but I personally think that the A sounds way more expressive and beautiful than the E. It just has such a melancholic warm sound to it. It seems to have a bit more substance than when we harmonize our C with an E. Now, why is that? Well, you can thank your ears and memory. You see, this G that leaps to the C lingers in our ears, even into the next bar. It kind of acts as a sort of phantom dissonance that gives us a slight tinge of an A minor seventh chord. Now I'm going to play it again, but this time I'm going to tie the G into the downbeat of the next bar, and then I'll play it as written without the tie. And now without the tie. So even when we didn't tie the G, that A minor seventh sound was still kind of there. I should mention that this phenomenon only happens when there's a leap involved. When lines move by step, we don't really hear the previous note as lingering because it literally merges into the next note. It becomes the next note. But when lines leap, we perceive them as two separate voices. The great part about this is that it's a perceptual principle, not a stylistic one. So let's go back to that D we had before. If we were writing in a more contemporary style, maybe a piece that relies heavily on chordal harmony, then the D would be the preferable note. The G would linger and give the impression of a D chordal structure. So already, you can see how this principle can be applied beyond counterpoint. It can be applied to real music. So you're probably wondering, okay, great. But were the great composers actually aware of this? Did they actually consciously apply this principle? And honestly, there's no real way of answering this without asking the composers themselves. But what we can do is look at their music and see if this crops up, if there's evidence of it. And one composer that I do think was consciously aware of this phenomenon was Bach. Here we have Bach's invention number 5 in E flat major. Let's take a listen. I want to focus on bar 2, particularly on these leaps from F up to E flat, and from D down to E flat. So these two leaps have always perplexed me. I mean, why did Bach at these two very specific moments decide to leap up a minor seventh and then down a major seventh? Sure, in free composition those leaps are allowed, but it's still a bit bizarre. I mean, if we look at the contour of the line, it's ultimately all going downward. Doesn't leaping up to that E flat kind of just disrupt the contour in a pretty abrupt way? Now, you're probably thinking, well, it's just an octave displacement in both cases. And that's true. But why did Bach decide to do this octave displacement? So let's see what would happen if Bach hadn't done the octave displacement. All I've done here is bumped the line down an octave to follow the natural contour of the whole passage. In the modified version, we can see that the passage now falls consistently downward and is ultimately more parsimonious. So what gives Bach? Aren't parsimony and beautiful lines the hallmarks of good counterpoint? Why is he throwing these crazy leaps at us? Before we move on, we should probably at least listen to this modified version, so here we go. Now, it doesn't sound bad, really at all, but I also just don't think it sounds as good as the original version. So, what's going on here? I think the original sounds better because Bach is doing exactly what we discussed previously. He's exploiting dissonance. When this F leaps up to E flat, it lingers in our ears and gives us a little taste of F minor 7, a dissonant harmony. It gives the line a bit more spice. The same exact thing happens when he leaps down from D to E flat, except this time we get a taste of an E flat major 7th chord. Now you're probably thinking, cool, but this passage is so fast I can't even pick up on that. Well, first I have to say that you should definitely play through this. Even if you're not a pianist and have to take it at a snail's pace, that kinesthetic connection will really help you hear this better. It's not just an oral thing. You feel the dissonance in your body when you play it on the piano. At least I do. Especially if we sing one of the lines while playing the other. But even still, at such a fast tempo, can we really hear this? Well, truth be told, I don't think that's the point. I'll never forget when I was in middle school band and the bassist was grooving along, and my band director stopped the band and looked at the bassist and said, "I don't want to hear the bass. I want to feel the bass." And I think that's exactly what's going on here. Upon first listening, we might not be aware of the fake chordal dissonance that Bach is implying, but I do think our ear notices that there's something special there. Like I said before, the modified version doesn't sound bad, but it doesn't sound as good. It's these small, seemingly arbitrary decisions, like this octave displacement, that I believe really elevate a work to a much higher level. Composers like Bach, Ravel, Schumann, Brahms, and many other greats were aware of every note they wrote and the impact of every decision they made. We as composers and musicians in general should try and build as much sensitivity to music as we can so that we can relish and appreciate these beautiful moments, and maybe even create some ourselves. Thanks for tuning in. Next episode we'll tackle a first species example, and I'll elaborate upon the rules while at the same time showing how to apply this lingering dissonance principle. Don't forget to subscribe, and I hope to see you all soon.